and do something!
Welcome. It's kind of nice getting back to doing episode 3. And nice to have some of my own digs. I have some high quality shit with me today. Cheers. I thought I would do something fun, since I have everyone basically over to my house this time. I'm cooking a meal with some ingredients that will make a little bit more sense as we kind of get going. There's been a lot of conversation about this project that I've been working on. First of all, it's been super delayed just because of a lot of different factors that I'll get into. But, there was this recent interview on the Brilliant podcast, which is a podcast done by Aragorn, who is part of LBC, in case if you're not yet familiar with it. There was this whole idea about identitarianism, and a lot of folks were asking me if I was kind of going a similar route with this project, or if this was just one of those things like, because I might have red hair, I must be Irish, or these other weird things that people in the U.S. do. But this is what used to be my grandmother's house before she passed away years ago, and it was kept in my family. My mother and her sisters helped to operate it, and my family was nice enough to let me stay here while I have been traveling around and just preparing for my next projects. So, when we talk about this past that I am exploring and why it is that maybe I decided to go as far back as I did, it's because, for me, my great-grandmother is still a pretty active part of my life. And not because she's still alive. I did know her when she was alive, but because my mother looks up to my great-grandmother so much and often tells me all these stories about her and about the way that she lived her life. And so, when I think to myself, well, who inspired my great-grandmother? For me, for someone so close to their family, this is not a strange question, in my opinion. And that has a direct impact on who I am. And so, I think that it's fun being in this house because I've had an opportunity to go through a bunch of old photos. So there is the previous tenant. That was back probably in I would guess maybe the 50s, and she's nice enough to let me stay. So I'm doing the best I can to kind of fill the place back up with the smell of food, which is something that I remember a lot in years past. So just to kind of bring it back to where we were before, because it has been probably a couple of months rather than a couple of weeks like I was thinking it was going to be. We're dealing with a group of people who were living in the borderlands between Scotland and Britain. And these people made a life by plunder. These people invented blackmail, and they invented the protection racket. They lived in huge towers that were fortified and extremely difficult to siege. And so the king, at the time of England and Scotland, trying to maintain control over this vast land, essentially said to them, hey, I've got this place that you might want to move. It's called Ulster. You'll have lands, you'll have more religious freedom, and so they go. I got some stock going in the background. That just came up to a boil, so I'm going to drop that down. I'm making soup today. So I got that out of the simmer. I've got a big pot here. I'm going to go ahead and start bringing that up to some temperature too, and I'll explain all that in a minute. The thing about this group of people who then were moved to the north of Ireland was that they were used as a firewall, essentially, between this plantation and meaning this populated area of British on Ireland, the island. And one of the things that they had started doing while they were out there is they were making cash from scalping the indigenous Irish. And so when we talk about sort of their movement from Ireland to the United States, this third episode here is going to be sort of a little bit about their culture because things start to move really fast. So one of the things that has delayed me in all of this has been the period of time is obviously old. There is a great shortage of general information on this group of people, the Ulster Scots or the Scots-Irish, whatever it is that you like to call it. I'm not sure why. But there is a lot of specific information. And so over these past couple of weeks, what I have sort of charged myself with is I have been reading a whole bunch of academic papers. Thesis, master's papers, all these different things that are focused exclusively on this group of people, who they were as a culture, what kinds of activities they were doing, what impression they had on politics, and all of these different kinds of things. But the issue is that when you're using academic papers, they are very, very, very focused. And so I had no shortage of academic papers to read, but reading so many of them to try and paint a generalized picture was a chore. A fun chore, but a chore. The other thing, too, is when they are coming into what would later become the United States, it didn't look at all like what we know today. Essentially what you end up with is a situation that, I'll go ahead and get sharpened because it sounds like everything is coming up the temp. You end up with a situation where southeastern Canada down into present-day Pennsylvania was owned by the French. You had the original colonies, which was owned by Britain at the time. So this would have been roughly Massachusetts down to, I want to say, Carolinas, which at the time was one state, not two. Now when you started to get into the very far south, Florida, Louisiana, these territories, because at the time, again, they weren't known as this would have been Spain, who was actually the first to arrive. Everything west of what we would consider to be modern-day East Coast in the United States was all backcountry and completely owned by various Native American tribes. And so when we talk about the world that these people were coming into, it was one that was widely questioned because there was a lot up in the air. Almost there. Good time for a sip. So, you have this group of people who is renowned for being poor and brutal as fuck. And so the colonists and the leadership of the various plantations and colonies were kind of scared on two different levels about having this huge swath of people emigrating from Northern Ireland to later United States. The first thing that they were worried about was the reputation of violence that preceded them. The second thing that concerned them was that because they were poor, they didn't know if they were going to put too much strain on what was the current day economic situation in the colonies. But the thing about it was that while some were afraid, others saw opportunity. Out there. So that time period in the United States was in so much turmoil that the populated so-called city centers saw an opportunity in having the Ulster Scots basically go back to the same job that they had when they were in Northern Ireland. They put them into the most dangerous conflict zone and began awarding them property there. So essentially they were in what was called the Ohio country, what we now know to be Pennsylvania, where you had the French pushing down and trying to essentially motivate the British to get the fuck out of there. And then you had many native tribes that were also coming up from the southwest and who also had claims to that area, which in the next episode we'll probably go a little bit more in depth on. So essentially what was happening was they were being used like a firewall, the same as they were with the indigenous in Ireland for the past 100 or so years. And so, as far as the economic side of this goes, what they didn't expect was that the Ulster Scots had a unique kind of wherewithal for making this sort of a move. They did two very interesting things, which was they introduced the hog and they introduced the potato to present-day United States. Lots of people think it was the Irish, and in fact it was the Ulster Scots. So in bringing these things, they actually were able to farm and maintain their own economic integrity, and beyond that, only 1 in 5 actually needed to indenture in order to afford the passage across the ocean. All of the others, the 4 out of 5, they all paid up front. So what kind of made this interesting is that once they got here and they saw what was going on, you ended up with a situation where even those who did pay either finished their indenture and were awarded land that they found to be lacking the amenities, the richness in soil, lack of rocks that one might actually expect to be able to have a family farm. Once this was discovered, what they started doing was just abandoning their indentures and any of the land that was awarded to them. At this point in time, they started to consider the price of land to be merely academic. They didn't give a shit. So what happened was you had all these folks, a smaller number, that came over, abandoned their indentures, joined those who paid in full, who no longer cared about property rights, who didn't care about buying it, who ended up pushing themselves out further and further into the backcountry, into the backwoods, and stealing the land from the native people. The colonists even had agreements with some of these tribes, where they were told that they would be able to keep these vast tracts of land. And so to have the Ulster Scots then start coming in and encroaching on those agreements, this was a very tough political situation for the natives and for the colonists. But when you have people who essentially are skilled at only a couple of things, warfare, including scalping, and living out on the frontier, like, unprotested because they're so good at protecting their communities, like they were when they were living in the borders as reavers, is what they were called. There's not a whole lot that you can do. So, today I'm making potato soup with bacon. Kind of a little celebration of the introduction of these ingredients to the United States. When I do more cooking in the future, it won't always be like this. I'll do some vegan stuff too. So I'm going to let that come down. I've got bacon sitting in the pan right now. I'm going to let that come up to temp, cook. I'm going to remove it. And then I'm going to add veg to it, which I'm going to start chopping here in just a minute, when I don't have to lean in because I didn't expect that this bacon was going to be this loud. Appreciate your patience. So, the process by which that these frontiers people would be taking over this land, since there was essentially no legal way that they were doing it, they used what they would call by right of the tomahawk. And you're probably beginning to see a little bit about why it's so challenging to study these people, because without there being any kind of purchase record, there's really not a whole lot that we have to follow in terms of their history and where they are moving as a people and these other sorts of things. Yellow onion. So, also I should point out, you might see me with a little pile here. All of my, well, I wouldn't say all of my, a select few kinds of ingredients, my vegetables and so forth, I freeze all of these and I use them to make my own stock, which is going to come into use later on. I already made that. You won't have to sit through that. So anyway, when you start to look through this history, basically what they did is they would go out and they would write their initials into the trees surrounding what they considered to be their property. And then, in addition to that, they would do something which was a new term to me, called girdling. And so what girdling is that when you have this tree, you cut a strip of bark away from the outer side down to the wood that is just underneath that. And in doing so, you slowly kill the tree. I was impressed by this because I had never heard of it before. I would encourage you to look it up, girdling, just because it's so interesting. One of the final things that they would do, in addition to these other two practices, is they would take a tomahawk or a hatchet and drive it into the tree, and that would be their final sort of signifier that this was claimed. And in my opinion, when you might see a tomahawk sitting in a tree with all the signs that Ulster Scots are there and what they're known for is scalping for cash, you leave the property alone. One of the interesting things about this, which was very different than their neighbors in, well, they're too tough to explain, their neighbors in Pennsylvania, was think they always kind of knew that they were going to be in a hurry. Because what they wouldn't do was, I'm just going to move this back, chopped onion. What they wouldn't do was remove the stumps, which other people living in present-day Pennsylvania would do as they were removing all these trees. The Ulster Scots would simply farm around the stumps that they had left behind as they were chopping everything down for lumber. And it was just kind of proof that, this was a nomadic people that expected that they wouldn't be on this property for very long, because they built quick, they moved quick, and they expanded quick. Because remember, from our last episode, there are a ton of people who are moving here in a very small period of time. So, I think that one of the things that is kind of interesting too to point out in this situation, I've got celery. So what I'm going to do is I am taking this vegetable and I'm going to be putting this in there with the onion after I remove the bacon. So there was a group of people who were living in Pennsylvania who were known as the Pennsylvania Dutch. The Pennsylvania Dutch were not Dutch. They were German. So kind of like when you have the Scots-Irish or the Ulster Scots, you also had this group of people who were named this thing that really didn't represent who they were. It's a fascinating story. I'd encourage people to look into it if you feel like it. But as it's not necessarily a big focus of this particular series, I will leave that up to you. The thing that kind of makes the German neighbor unique for this is this was the beginning of the pacifist movement in Pennsylvania and the United States. And so you have essentially this group of pacifists who allow the highest degree of religious freedom in so-called United States, and this attracted all of the Ulster Scots to this area. However, the Ulster Scots were far from being pacifists, and so there was a great deal of tension between these two groups, even though essentially it's like they had the highest degree of freedom and the largest degree of tension. Well, I wouldn't say the largest degree either. Again, it's complicated because there's so many moving parts. But there is an old saying that essentially you could tell the difference between the Germans and the Ulster Scots, because while the Germans would move to a new area and build a barn, the Ulster Scots would move to a new area and build a whiskey still. Taking my bacon out. So I've got carrots. These carrots are going to join the celery and the onion inside the pot that I basically just removed for that. So in just a moment I'm going to go ahead and take care of that. Kind of a fun exercise doing cooking and talking at the same time. I mean, I do this whenever I have people over at the house, but this is a very focused subject. And so it's fun trying to juggle what I've got going on back here with what I got going on up here. By the way, you should probably never talk with your hands when you've got a knife in one of them. Oops. Alright, so in all this goes I'm going to cook that down until they soften up. Gotta grab a spoon. And there's still a lot of heat left over from cooking the bacon, so I went ahead and dumped them all at the same time. I'm not worried about it. What I am going to do, though, is add a little bit of salt to help them break down a little bit faster and sweat while they're cooking down. What I've got here is garlic. So anyway, back to the whiskey still. What made this group kind of interesting is they like to fight. And the whiskey certainly didn't slow that down. However, they could trade the whiskey with both the natives and the Germans and the British for guns, for farming tools, for whatever it was that they might need. They were an extroverted people. A lot of singing, a lot of dancing. They even invented much of their own language, which we'll get into later on as they kind of pioneered what we now know today to be bluegrass and a whole very interesting dialect in the mountains of just beyond the East Coast of the United States. So they were kind of already aware of the fact, the Ulster Scots, that they would not be able to live around the Germans for very long because the tensions weren't getting any better. And so they started to bring back an old practice, which was scalping for bounty. And this is going to be very important later, because essentially, while the bounty existed, the Ulster Scots would be able to afford taking a break from farming. So normally what they would be doing is cash crops, like hemp, tobacco, potato, hog, other assortments of things. And in order to, skip some of those farming duties and still be able to make a living for their very large families, they had scalping bounties. That would essentially allow for them to not only afford their lifestyle, but to continue pushing the frontier boundaries further and further west and further south. There's nothing to celebrate about that. I think that the violence that these people expressed, I'm sure that they thought at the time was necessary, and it's only in hindsight now that we can really say how tragic it exactly was. So, another one of the things that's interesting about this, and also builds into them expanding further and further away from Pennsylvania, and attempting to escape the Quakers, is because in the early colonies, you had essentially a government run by the various churches. So what you had was clergy making decisions about libel disputes, about community disputes, even about immorality, and specifically about sexual immorality. And it would be a long time before this would change into being the United States, and therefore a government run by representation as opposed to a government run by the church, whatever that church might be. So the Ulster Scot is, of this time period, a Presbyterian who is deeply ingrained in what is called Calvinism, and there will be a religious episode that I end up doing that I'll probably go a little bit more in depth on, but just to put it plainly, this is what we would probably refer to today as being very conservative. The imagery that the Ulster Presbyterians relied upon quite a bit was a sort of rebellious one, a revolutionary one of martyrdom. Additionally, it really spotlighted individual discipline that was maintained through group surveillance, which in my opinion sounds a little familiar. Garlic. I'm going to hold off on that while I sweat the rest of these ingredients, because when you add garlic too early, it burns really fast and then makes everything else taste like shit. I'm going to stir. I wish I could show you. We're only just starting to brown. But it smells amazing. This combination of the onions, the celery, and the carrots is renowned as being one of the most basic sauces that you would start with. There's an amazing book that I would highly recommend called The Saucier's Apprentice if you are ever interested in learning more about sauces. Warming up a little bit too, which is kind of nice. I got my gnome hat, which is making it feel a little bit hot. But what are you going to do? So, what I've got coming in now, I don't know if you're familiar with these things. That's potato. I'm going to cut what down in the South we'd say a mess. I'm going to cut a mess of potatoes. I think I'm going to start with 6. I'm going to see what that looks like. I also need to probably rinse them a little bit, so give me one quick sec. These are the glories of not editing and doing something for the first time. Next time, I'll have a bucket of water. The veg is cooking down fast. It's kind of reached that point now where it's sweating and it's starting to cook in its own juices, so it's going to take me not very much longer before I'm going to add that garlic in to kind of put it back at that next stage. So, what we're talking about is these guys heading out into the woods, trying to get a little bit kind of like into their own scene, a little bit outside of the German pacifist scene. And, you know, in part this is because, you know, the Ulster Scots speak English. They don't speak German. And so it makes sense that they'd want to be around people who they had an easy time communicating with. I'm just going to do like a rough chop on these because they're going to cook down after they get browned a little bit, and everything's going to get blended together anyway. It doesn't need to be nothing fancy. So, in addition to having these very large populations of Ulsters coming out and joining those who are already in existence there, they're having up to 10 to 15 kids per household. That's a huge amount. And later on actually has a huge impact because, I'll go more into depth in this in a future episode, but they were very slow to adopt having slaves compared to the British and to some of the other cultures that were around in colonial America. They would rather have more children to do the labor, and they would end up actually bringing in indentures of their own. So there was something that was going on there that, again, there isn't a lot of record to talk about why they were slow to do that and why they would rather have had kids than to own slaves. However, again, in retrospect, this seems pretty fucking obvious, but rare. The other thing that was kind of interesting about them is these were people of letters. They wrote many, many, many letters. And they were very interested in having their opinions heard. What that meant was that homeschooling was an enormous focus. So what you ended up with is this emigration path from them originally coming to so-called United States and leaving behind as they move further and further, I'm doing it again, further and further out into the backcountry, leaving behind a trail of breadcrumbs, which were Presbyterian churches and homeschooling situations where essentially all of these kids were being educated, and that would also have a huge impact later on. Now, these Presbyterian churches that they were leaving behind as breadcrumbs ended up having an enormous impact because we started being able to actually have records for the first time to track how it was that these people were moving around. And until we had those church records, we didn't even really know how it was that a family might move from Delaware, where the ship might arrive, or Massachusetts, and then moving over into Pennsylvania, and then later on, curving down into the south. I feel like a weatherman. Having these records was one of the very few opportunities for us to be able to study who these people were as people. The kinds of things that it was that the church needed to step in and settle in terms of disputes. And then also, essentially once they had established their own churches, they began to do things their own way rather than by colonist law, which meant you even started to see things like marriages, property purchases, and so on. The impact that they had on the Native American tribes was immense. And so this, on the 7-Year War, again to return to this concept, was really screwing everything up. This group of people who essentially moved in, did everything by their own right of the blade, or by the tomahawk as it were, refused to acknowledge the way things were being done, ended up creating so much tension between various native tribes, between the colonists and the natives, and between themselves and the natives, would have a huge and lasting impact. So, I'm about to add this garlic. garlic is in there. Just long enough to really kind of, long enough that I can smell it, basically. Because I'm going to add flour. And it's quite brown now. I'm going to add flour to it, not a lot, just kind of enough to coat it. After my flour has coated my veg, I'm going to pour my stock in that I had made already. It's a chicken stock. And these ingredients that I have here that were left over from my prep, I've just got, I've got carrots, garlic skins, celery, and some of these rinds from the onion. If you just put those into your freezer and collect them over time, really, really good. So, as that cooks, I'm going to kind of break down these next couple episodes. What they will end up being is the 7 Years' War will be the next one, where I go a little bit more in depth into talking about the situation in Pennsylvania, and then kind of the further immigration as they go south. After that, I'm going to talk about something that I wasn't even immensely aware of until I started doing all of this research. What that's going to be is, this is my flour. What that's going to be is essentially a group called the Paxton Boys in the North, and you have the North Carolina Regulators, and a couple of other small groups that carried on this tradition of rejecting colonial law and saying, no, fuck you, we'll do us, we don't need you, we don't think that you're taking care of security in the way that it needs to be, so we're going to take matters into our own hands. The time period of this occurring was really tied into the Cherokee Wars and to many wars between these different Native American factions. And again, we're talking about 5-10 year differences between each of these things, and really all within the same 15 years. The American Revolution occurs, and that will be its own episode, the American Revolution. The last one that will happen in this sort of deep historical look back so I've got potatoes are going to go in now. They're going to be joining all of the veg before the flour. Not for long, just long enough that they can kind of take on that heat and take on that flavor. So after the American Revolution episode, I'll be doing one on religion, which ends up being very important, not only to the Ulsters, but specifically to my family. After going over that subject, I'll probably start going a little bit more in depth in my family in particular. So, it was the very late 1700s where you have all of these things that I just mentioned, right? Like the American Revolution. To put this into perspective about how this impacts the story as far as I am taking it, I can directly trace my family now in North Carolina back to the 1740s. to a graveyard that is now abandoned out in the middle of the woods on what used to be a very large family farm. I'm in the midst of contacting the property owner so that I can take my family out there to go and see it. This group of people are not that many generations away from my family. And so, after covering these other subjects, we'll start kind of jumping into that. And my eventual hope with this program is to turn it into a sort of daily journal of what it is that I'm doing to take these lessons that I have learned from my family, the principles that they have impressed upon me, and what it is I'm doing on a daily basis to essentially hustle into having the kind of financial freedom and the kind of relationships that one might need in order to experience good outcomes with more sophisticated anarchist projects. I really appreciate you coming and joining me at my new house. The next couple episodes will probably be done here as opposed to out in the woods because, you know, it's not the summer anymore. It's beautiful out there, but we'll see how it goes. There's some woods up the street that I might go out into. But cheers to you, and I'll see you next time.